Hey guys, welcome back to the OPD podcast with Joe and Austin. As always, we have a very special guest today that I've been pretty hyped to get on. Austin knows because I've been messaging him about this quite a bit this week. We have Dr. Scott Howell, someone who I respect a great deal in this industry, who's doing brilliant work in terms of bringing light to the harm reduction element of performance enhancing drug usage. That's very much shining light on what young bodybuilders, bodybuilding enthusiasts should be looking at. So I'll say no more on that. Scott, I'll let you introduce yourself, what you do, then we'll roll into the main topic being the primary things that people using performance enhancing drugs should be watching out for, and potentially then we could get into ways to attenuate the negative health effects as well.
So, thanks for the introduction. My experience is in medicine, epidemiology, mechanical engineering, and I'm the research director for the Tier 1 Center for Research, and it's part of a preventative medicine practice in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Tier 1 Health and Wellness. So, our focus and my focus for a long time has been on health. I have what makes my experience sort of interesting to academics and also for lifters is I've actually used the drugs that I talk about. And it was one of the reasons that I actually went into formal study for it. So, I don't know how far, actually, I'm just going to roll. I'm going to tell you guys a story. How about that?
Yeah.
I first used anabolics at age 16. And I was trying to get into the military early. I graduated high school early, and I started using 200 milligrams of testosterone cypionate and Anadrol 50, one tablet per day. Mm-hmm. And I used that cycle for 8 weeks, and I gained almost 30 pounds. And it was like a life-altering event for me because it was so fast, it was so quick. I responded very well. And then when I left the military, I came off cold turkey. And so my HPG access took forever and a day to get back online. And, as soon as I got back out of the military, I started using anabolic steroids again. And over a 3 to 4 year period, it escalated. I used really, really high doses. And the forums at that time, all the guys on the forums were saying, well, just take a couple of grams, do this or do that. Use DMP for this amount of time. Make sure that you're taking 50 micrograms, 100 micrograms of T3 and all this crazy junk. And so I come to a point, though, that I experienced a paradigm shift. I had my own health scare. And it sort of shocked me back into reality to realize that what I was doing was not maintainable. So from that point, that motivated me to actually search for the truth, and the truth regarding what is the real side effects of androgens compared to what is not. And because you have all these people on both sides saying, oh, it's extreme. Like government programs, different countries talk about guys just falling over dead, this, and that. And then on the other side, with guys that use, oh, no, it's not that bad. You can use up to a certain dose. As long as you don't go above that dose, you're fine. And so I collected, I amassed over close to 40,000 studies over a 15-year period when I was going to school. And some of these studies dated back to the 1800s. And one was the latter end of the 1800s by a guy named Brown Sequard. You guys probably know who I'm talking about. So he published this case report, and it was a self-case report where he injected himself with animal testicular extracts, and he was 72 years old, and he reported that it restored his vitality and all that junk. So these studies have went back that far all the way up to the present day. Now, since that time, I've collected thousands of case reports from all over the world. I've contacted pathologies. I've asked coroners for autopsy reports when I would see something in the media about someone dying from anabolics. And I started to categorize these. and actually filed them away. So what immediately came to my mind when I was doing my dissertation, when I was actually going through the literature review and it took me almost 5 years to write this literature review. And it was, how can I organize this amount of evidence and actually make it coherent? And so it dawned on me at that time to focus on toxicology. So I dug into toxicology, and then I started going through all the studies that were not all, only a fraction really. I started going through studies, and I started organizing them. And what I found was that there were 3 distinct toxicity forms involved with anabolic steroids that have been mentioned explicitly in literature. And above and beyond that, I cataloged and mapped 6 more. So when individuals tell me that anabolic steroids are inherently safe, that comes with a huge caveat. So I don't want to eat up all this time. Did you guys have any questions or anything?
Please do, please do. There's a couple of connection issues where you're just going a bit choppy, but everything's understood, so I think we're all good. But if you could delve into those primary pathways, that would be amazing.
Okay, well, one of the things that you have to consider when you want to determine the magnitude of a side effect or some toxicity form is, what is the measure of a reversibility? What is the capacity to reverse any changes that occur? So what I found was that in a lot of tissues, there is a capacity to reverse damage, but in some tissues, the damage is permanent. So with the toxicity forms that I found, if you look at cardiotoxicity, that was one of the first that was established in the literature. A guy named Melcher in the 1980s did some bench work. And basically what he did was apply different androgen types directly to cardiomyocytes in cell culture. And he established a direct toxicity form. Now, I don't really agree with the conclusions that were reached by the study because it didn't mimic the internal physiology of the body. But going past that and looking at all the study, or most of the studies that have been conducted with anabolics using very high doses, what I found was there was a distinct cardiotoxicity phenotype, and it is characterized by a diffuse collagen infiltration. Now that diffuse collagen infiltration is deposited between the myofibers. And what happens over time is it leads to fibrosis. And if there's left ventricular hypertrophy, if it's concentric left ventricular hypertrophy, then this will eventually lead to a loss of conduction velocity. So if you think of the apex of the heart at the very bottom, and the heart starts to depolarize, and it sends, the depolarization goes upward through the Purkinje fibers, the heart has to contract in a simultaneous pattern. And when collagen gets in between the myofibers, it interferes with that. So you get basically a loss of conduction velocity. And when you lose that function, when you start to have functional or performance changes of the heart, then you know that there is tissue damage that cannot be reversed. But in some of the case reports that I've looked at, or the bulk of them, there is one common point of the pathology that's with all of them, and that is concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you guys know the difference between the types of pathologic hypertrophy of the heart, but basically when you have eccentric hypertrophy, the heart enlarges, but the myocardium gets thinner. So the actual volume on the inside of the ventricles it's larger. So this is a volume overload. And it occurs when these sarcomeres in the muscle are added in series to other existing sarcomeres. Now, in contrast to what happens in athletes and bodybuilders, And it also happens with resistance training, and I'll get back to that in a second, but this is pressure overload with concentric hypertrophy. What happens is these sarcomeres are added in parallel, so the myocardium actually gets thicker. So the ventricle volume decreases. And what that does is over time, the ejection fraction starts to drop. So if you track athletes or bodybuilders that use high-dose anabolic steroids over a decade, what you will see is if they're not taking angiotensin enzyme converting inhibitor, or if they're not taking an ARB, they will continually start to drop their ejection fraction from year to year. And also the aortic root and different other stationary points of the heart will start to thin out.
Okay, can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
Because ARBs are something Joe and I have talked about before. But I had some questions on them because I wasn't, I know the ARBs are kind of, I know they're not new, but they are a newer gen of cardiovascular or blood pressure type of supplement. But there are a lot of them. And I know there were like certain recalls on certain ones and this and that. Are there ones that you prefer for someone in this situation?
Definitely. I've looked into the ARBs and the ACE inhibitors. Now, let's make this point really clear. It's better to have any one of them than not have anything when it comes to angiotensin 2. But as far as the best, I use olmesartan.
Okay.
It's a newer one. Telmisartan is also good too. As far as ACE inhibitors, lisinopril is fairly cheap. It's effective. But if you want the optimal, I would move to a next generation, the ARBs.
Yeah, ARBs. And I know I've seen some different, obviously this is all hypothetical, but we're talking like preventative dose. We're talking like 10, 20 milligrams.
Oh,
or more.
Well, it depends on which one, because like with losartan, the first therapeutic dose. So if you look at being treated for hypertension, you have different tiers with hypertensives. So there's a first line, second line, third line. Now, if you look at like what would be a first line, usually if someone started on losartan, which losartan is an effective ARB as well, it's usually 50 milligrams per day. Now, when you said hypothetical, there is evidence in the literature that shows high dose anabolics coupled with angiotensin blockade and full attenuation of the pathology I'm talking about. There's been 3 studies that's been conducted on it. So we do have some data to work with, but as far as extrapolating those doses for the angiotensin blockade to humans, that is sort of problematic because of allometric scaling. The same with dosing animals as well. I don't really agree with the allometric scaling of dose, but because we're talking about hormones, we're not talking about like drugs of abuse or like recreational drugs.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I should have been more specific because I know olmesartan, telmisartan, losartan. I know there's several of them, so I'm sure the doses probably vary a little bit per which drug you're talking about. Yeah, that's cool because I know Joe's written an article or two about ARBs and we've talked about them, but I obviously I have a lot of clients that are, maybe they have hypertensive, runs in their family, or they're just, I don't know, they're just weight, or they are, and obviously all those things we try to fix through nutrition and whatnot, but especially guys that are on anabolics that are just very heavy, because if you weigh 250 to 300 pounds, it is what it is no matter how you hold it. It's it's still a lot of weight, and some of these guys they can't see their blood pressure come up. And I know when they go in and talk to their physician, I kind of nudge them towards the ARB. So it's good to hear that.
Well, you know, you mentioned weight, and what a lot of people don't consider when it comes to weight and gaining all this lean body mass, it's the equivalent of being obese, except you're lean when it comes to the afterload on the heart. So you have this residual afterload that your heart has to maintain all the time. And if you talk to a professional bodybuilder, IFBB pro, almost none of them like to walk up steps because they get winded walking up steps. Well, I mean,
yeah.
So, but with these things, I think the studies that I mentioned to you, they use losartan in those studies. And there was also another drug that was used, and one of them, I can't think of it right now, but as far as the degree of how far this pathology can go, one of the main things that I try to tell every individual that I do consults with harm reduction is, what would damage you might not damage the next person, but we don't know where that line is. And genetics play a big role in all this. The amount of ACE expression that leads to angiotensin II. So what I like to do with the guys that I do really intensive consultations with, I run their genetics. I map out some different genes with some composite tests that I've developed. And what I do is I go back through and I look to see what their predisposition for normal diseases like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all the main hitters. And then I start to map out the direction I'm going to take them. But it's really, if you think about outcomes and how much it varies, we know that there's a 40% variation in response from man to man in androgens. And what I mean by that is their own internal androgens or any androgens that are introduced exogenously, like anabolic steroids. There's a 40% variation in response. And when I tell people that, they look at me like I'm crazy, but it's the truth. And it's a genetic origin for that variation. So have you ever wondered why one guy could take 250 milligrams to 500 milligrams of testosterone only and seem like he just blew up over a short period of time? Then the next guy, he would take 1,000 and could never ever get that fullness or that size.
Yeah,
it's based on genetics.
And with that too, I mean, obviously, if they say that, then they've never seen it in practice. But I mean, we see it all the time. That's and 40% might even be like a soft number.
Oh,
you know,
the biological individuality that we've seen, Austin. You know, we both know people that can, you know, sniff a bottle of test and add what looks like 30 pounds of actual test. And some people that haven't changed despite doses that are, you know, ridiculous.
Well, you know, I still get a lot of people that ask me that if they've been on cycle for however long, they say that their androgen receptors are messing up, they need to be cleared out. And I'm just thinking in the back of my mind, oh, wow, what am I getting into? Because I always have to go back over that androgen receptors do not downregulate, they upregulate with increasing dose, and it's dose responsive, and there's no upper ceiling to it. There's no upper ceiling I could find whatsoever. So if you keep increasing the dose, what does the body do in response? It increases the number of receptors as a failsafe. And aromatase, the aromatase gene, it's a fail-safe mechanism for if you input a certain amount of testosterone, it outputs the correct amount of estradiol for that person based on their genetics. So I look for fail-safes and latch onto those, because I believe that those, when I can make an analogy about something, it will stick. But as far as the variation, in response to androgen therapy, as far as benefits, if you look at the other side, if you look at outcomes, I did a comparison for a client just maybe it was last month, really. And I wrote a 50-page report for this gentleman, and I mapped out his total androgen exposure over the course of 15 years. So I mapped out what he had reported that he had taken, and over this 15-year period, the cumulative amount of androgen exposure was over 3 kilos. So he had been on high doses for a long time. And so I really wanted to shock him back into reality as far as his life moving forward, because he's 35 years old now and has already had congestive heart failure at age 24.
Oh, wow.
So I pulled Dallas McCarver's autopsy report and Rich Piana's autopsy reports. Now, if you objectively look at those, there hasn't been a single physician that's reviewed these autopsy reports that I agree with, because I think they missed the boat. If you look at Dallas McCarver, all of his organs, if you compare them to normative values based on these studies where they did like 200 or 300 autopsies of men and women of certain age ranges, or they did it for men, then they did it for women. But they established what the average organ size was for the kidneys, the heart, the liver, the lungs, all that. If you look at Dallas McCarver, his heart was over 3 times the normal size. It was 833 grams. He had concentric left ventricular hypertrophy, and there was no actual cause of death that was mentioned in the autopsy report that was definitive. But if you look at a normal heart weight, that's around 330, 40 grams. His was 833. Now, if you compare that to Rich Piana's, his was 670 grams. It was double. So the variation in the adverse effects here, Rich Piana probably, he'd been taking anabolic steroids a whole lot longer than Dallas McCarver. So if it was a consistent mechanism across the board, his heart would be just as big as Dallas's. So this genetic component really plays in. And if you look at the liver of Dallas McCarver, it was over 3 times larger than normal. He had a 4,593 gram liver. And a normal liver is around 1,500. His kidneys were over 3 times. So my point here is that the outcomes, there's a huge variation in outcomes as well as far as adverse effects. But the interesting thing is, Dallas McCarver died from sudden cardiac death, and that there was no infarct that was listed in the autopsy report. So now that is one form of toxicity that a lot of people know about. Now it is partially reversible. Now the point where it's not reversible is when fibrosis actually occurs. When fibrosis sets into the heart, that it's non-reversible. That will not. So when I was on high dose testosterone one time, and I had my issue, I had an echo done and with the ejection fraction and all that, and I decided to get repeated measures of that echo for 3 times. I did one at 6 months after I dropped the dose, and then 6 months after when I'd been on just a replacement dose. And those parameters changed a lot over that period. I really didn't have any big issues as far as dysfunction, but the estimated size of my heart did shift back down, and the ejection fraction did increase. So there is some degree of reversibility. Now, if you consider other forms of injury from anabolic steroids, if you guys could like think of one right off the top of your head, what would it be?
I mean, you mean other outside of the cardiovascular?
Yes.
I mean, commonly, I guess. I mean, second most common probably be kidney renal related, I guess.
Okay, so that form is nephrotoxicity, and it was explicit in the literature. There's one there's a genetic risk that's predisposed for focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. It's really hard to get out, but it's FSGS. And if you look at a lot of professional bodybuilders that have had kidney failure and had to have kidney transplants, I would bet either of you $100 that they have this genetic predisposition. But
Right.
nephrotoxicity is the phenotype of injury is, well, it's predisposed because of uncontrolled hypertension. So if we think about all these organ systems overlapping, if you have uncontrolled hypertension, it will damage the nephrons of the kidneys. And the actual nephrotoxicity occurs secondary to androgen-induced liver injury. So usually what occurs is the liver gets too much stress. And when it gets stressed, and sometimes when a lot of methylated orals are taken, other drugs are taken on top of that, DMP, all the nasty stuff, the liver gets overloaded. And when the liver gets overloaded, it doesn't break down all those metabolites like they need to be to actually pass through the kidneys. So, and then you also have bile that's released into the bloodstream, and that bile will damage the nephrons. So the liver can regenerate. That's the organ with the highest amount of regenerative capacity. But kidneys cannot. They're basically fixed. So once your filtration rate starts to drop from years of continuous damage, that will not restore. So to take this back to the consultation I just did, there was a substantial drop. And the only recommendation for someone that starts dropping below 40 with a GFR is you have to take a large amount of protein out of your diet, and you have to take any afflicting agent out, or it will continue to drop. And if you think of your organs as having an organ reserve, it's like if you're an adult, you have the maximal reserve that you're going to have for any organ. With age over time, it drops. Till the end of life, the organ reserve may be at 10, 15%. Well, if you think of it in that way, any allostatic load on any organ is not good over the long haul. So it's just one of the things that I like to communicate. But you know, whether or not it's actually internalized, there's with the guys that I did consultations with, and we've actually tried to come off high doses and stay on replacement doses. Almost every one of these guys has dysmorphia, and they eventually start using high dose again. So I don't know what you guys have experienced, but has that been common for you?
Yeah. I mean, you're dealing with, well, why did they do it in the first place? You know what I mean? That would be the question. Like, what were they trying to achieve? And that would probably give you the answer if they had dysmorphia or not. I mean, I think we all do a little bit. It's just, do we have it? What outweighs what? You know, if we, I think the problem also becomes, in like your case, when you're doing harm reduction, is if they have this some amount of dysmorphia, but then they also see that they have some type of issue with their health parameters, which one is more important to them? You know, when they
it's interesting you bring that up, because that was exactly the reason why I compared those case reports side by side. And
right.
in this whole write-up, I do a write-up for all my clients. And I use the literature, and I show them what's there and what's directly applicable to them. And if you want somebody to have a paradigm shift, it has to be a shift. It's a moment in time where they realize, I can't do this any longer, or I have to change something. And almost every time that someone has been successful with me, it's because they either had a very, very nasty health scare, or something in their family, they lost a loved one, something shifted them out of themselves to actually start caring about their health.
Right. It's like what I get, where is that point? It's that, but it's going to vary so much from person to person, unfortunately.
It does. And it's sort of sad too, because even in literature, approximately 33% of all males that initiate anabolic steroid use will not stop the use, regardless of adverse health effects, regardless of legal problems.
Yeah. So we were talking about, where that line is, right? And like you said, unfortunately, sometimes there has to be a major event. But let's say, I mean, do you get a lot of people that come in and just say, hey, I'm interested in doing XYZ, how can I be safe?
Yeah.
Do you get that much?
Yeah, I get guys, I get athletes contacting me wanting to know how to beat biological passport parameters. I have bodybuilders contacting me wanting me to review what some guru had shown them, and I give them the option of having just a one-off consultation, or a situation where there's consultations every couple of months. And so if it's with an individual that has taken anabolic steroids, but they have tried to come off and they can't, and I know that sounds sort of weird, but it's more common than what you would think. Guys get locked into this every time they come off, they start to lose muscle mass, and then they immediately want to get back on again. And they get locked in this cycle of trying to come off, but not really knowing how. They're scared. They don't want their testosterone levels to be completely tanked. And that's when I try to motivate them to meet with me at least once every 3 months, or sometimes on a monthly basis, to keep them in check. And basically, what I do is I map out a direction for them. I show them what can logically be done, and I give them options. Now, as far as guys that are competing and things like that, I have reviewed different courses of anabolics and different drugs that guys have planned to use, and they wanted me to review it. I do those type things, but it's always with the caveat of trying to motivate them to look at their health in a different way.
Scott, can I ask you something here? For the listeners, being that we've only got maybe 20 minutes left on here, I wanted to ask you some kind of quick fire questions for people listening, like that maybe just want a real practical answer to their own stack design solution. So many of our listeners are going to be super physiological users of performance enhancing drugs for physique outcomes. So if I was going to ask you, and I know this is a highly oversimplified question with no context that makes it very difficult to answer, but a couple of things like, are there any testosterone derivatives or just general anabolic androgenic steroid molecules that one should always avoid? Are there ancillary drugs that one should always avoid, like we've berated on aromatase inhibitors being avoided on the podcast many times? I don't know if you agree or disagree there. That would be cool to hear your opinion. And also, are there any drugs that maybe should be deployed in a year-round fashion? We've given the example of angiotensin receptor blockers and things like metformin on here before. Again, it'd be interesting to see if you agree with that or not. So maybe those three things. Sorry, that's a lot to throw at you, but is there anything that you generally agree there?
Well, no, I do agree. There are certain things that you want to stay away from. There are certain things that you want to do. There are practical steps that you can take. Now, depending on which area it is, I can get really in depth, but I'm going to keep it general. So with the anabolics, the main thing in my mind is non-aromatizable androgens. Mm-hmm. So if you take non-aromatizable androgens and you take nothing else, then you have no estradiol that's being produced. Well, you have estradiol, but it's not produced in sufficient amounts. Mm-hmm. So if you take DHT derivatives and you take them a lot, then you should probably drop back your frequency unless you're taking testosterone in the mix as well. Now, even though you're taking testosterone in the mix, you have to measure it in total androgen load. So if you consider the androgens that are going into the system that are available to binding, you have to maintain the androgen to estradiol ratio.
Right.
And that estradiol ratio, that ratio is predicated on the aromatase enzyme. So if you take aromatizable, it will always level itself out. If you take non-aromatizable, then you have to input estrogen from somewhere. And when I suggested one time that estradiol orally should be included in some of these guys taking only DHT derivatives, I was sort of looked at like I was crazy, but it would actually be a good course of action.
So there you go, guys. Joe and I are not crazy. You have an official licensed medical
confirmation
practitioner.
bias is ringing out my
Yes, we have.
looking over here.
Because we have been drilling that forever, and you get a lot of mixed emotions. We just had one of our guests talking about the potential for use for exogenous estradiol too, and yeah, that's cool. So I won't rant about that, but that's
well,
like that.
I mean, if you actually look at what estradiol does in a man when it's actually given in oral form, I actually pulled a trial 2 days ago. But if you look at preventative medicine, excuse me, Dr. Neil Rouzier, he trains physicians in preventative medicine and hormones. And I was at one of the training sessions, and he was talking about prostate cancer patients being treated with oral estradiol. And what he did was, he wasn't really talking about the outcomes to the prostate cancer. He was talking about the favorable modulation of the lipid profile. So I don't know if you guys know this or not, but all esterized forms that you inject, any esterized form, will have an adverse effect on HDL cholesterol. So if it's testosterone replacement therapy, it will, if you take cypionate, enanthate, propionate, any esterized form, it has a negative impact on HDL cholesterol. None of these testosterone replacement meals tell you that. But if you use, in that situation, if you use a cream, like a Versa-based cream, and you apply it to the scrotum a couple times a day, then you get a favorable modulation of the lipid profile. So you always have to keep in mind all the different things that are really going on. But estradiol is not a male's enemy. It's not. It's, if you think, it's actually, if you think of testosterone replacement therapy and the beneficial effects that you get, most of those beneficial effects are predicated on the aromatized estradiol. And that's just how it is. And I guess it goes back to early on, I believe it was Dan Duchesne that recommended sourcing aromatase inhibitors by complaining of estrogen symptoms. Well, if those estrogen symptoms don't really exist. And if you think about some of the, I guess, issues that are going on, like when guys go on Trenbolone and some other potent anabolics, and they have these, their mood goes haywire and all that. Well, what do you think is going on? Well, if you actually look at the affinity of Trenbolone to mineralocorticoid receptors, progesterone receptors, and androgen receptors, it has a 3 times higher affinity for the progesterone receptor than progesterone itself. And if you look at progesterone given to women, it stabilizes their mood. Well, it has a paradoxical effect in men. That's why it's not used in men. But as far as, I won't try to get too far into a rabbit hole, but as far as auxiliaries, excuse me.
I just want to say before you carry on, you mentioned the name there, Dr. Rouzier. I've followed him for a long time. So anybody listening as well, don't glance over that. That is somebody to check out. I'm especially a fan of his work on testosterone-induced increases in hematocrit, and hemoglobin. So anybody interested in safer use of androgens, do check out Dr. Neil Ruzio as well. Sorry, Scott.
Oh, no, that's fine. You actually touched on a subject that I've been working on a manuscript for about a year now, and it's on secondary erythrocytosis.
Okay, interesting.
And so if you're on testosterone replacement therapy, there is no rational need to phlebotomize.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is you get iron deficiency anemia if it's too frequent. And in our practice, every 1 out of maybe 10 guys that come from a TRT mill, they have iron deficiency anemia.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a completely different thing. Actually, that's the topic of another podcast.
Yes.
Definitely. But as far as auxiliaries, definitely an ARB or an ACE inhibitor, drugs to stay away from. I'm not a fan of DMP. I never have been.
Mm-hmm.
I have about 60 case reports from munitions workers way back in different wars. And DMP is nasty. It will kill you if you get too high of a dose in too short a period of time. When the lethal dose is close to the effective dose, then you have a problem. So I don't recommend anything that has any nature like that. If you look at the case
chemical uncouplers at all, so you're not a fan of a chemical uncoupler, or you're not a fan of drugs that are relatively close between the minimum effective and the LD50.
Yes, that's the latter. And I found that if you think of the rationale of most bodybuilders, it's always more is better, and it does not apply to DMP.
No.
In any stretch. So as far as combinations of drugs to avoid, if you look at the case reports, okay, there's some commonalities for fatalities, acute myocardial infarctions, and all this. It is a combination of beta adrenergics like clenbuterol, high dose T3, and stimulants coupled with anabolic steroids.
Mm.
That's really common. I probably have 50 case reports where that combination is going on. Another thing that I advise is if you're using anabolic steroids, do not go out recreational drinking all the time. Do not go and binge drink on the weekends, because that organ load that we're talking about, you really start to stress it when you have too many things that's going into your system. As far as diuretics, those are so precarious. And I saw the guy, Luke Sando, he was on some podcast, and I can't remember who it was with, but
might have even been this one when he talked about when he went hyperkalemic when he was working with Chris Aceto from misdoses diazide. Yes.
Well, if you actually think about it, I'm really, when I listened to him talk, I wasn't convinced that it was a viral infection.
Mm.
I was convinced that there was an electrolyte shift early on, and it kept on building up and building up.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to take diuretics, start with the lowest dose that you can. Prepare something well before a competition to see how you dry out. Avoid potassium-sparing diuretics. It's simple is the best way. And if you can do it without the diuretic, fine. But I know that most competitors now do use diuretics in some form, and they start early on. Trying to think if there's anything else. Obviously,
like about aromatase inhibitors, is that something that you recommend against using?
Definitely. I recommend against it in bodybuilders. I recommend against using SERMs, selective estrogen receptor modulators like tamoxifen, because they increase a thrombosis risk. So if you look at the case reports of thrombosis, of ventricular thrombosis or thrombosis, deep vein thrombosis, any thrombosis, a SERM will increase the risk of thrombosis, as well as an ACE inhibitor, or aromatase inhibitor will.
Mm.
One of the problems, these studies that have come out that they've linked testosterone to thrombosis. You've probably heard of those.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Well,
it's not. Okay, keep going.
well, it's definitely not. But
Right.
what is the mechanism? Well, what's always missed is aromatase inhibitor use or SERMs use. That is the confounding factor. And that was a tidbit that's going to be in the paper that I'm going to be publishing. So just a tidbit for anyone out there, stay away from the SERMs because they will increase the risk for thrombosis.
And even now, I think people are probably listening going, well, it's all well and good saying avoid AIs, but what about, when I run this stack or this stack? I think we come back to exactly what you talked about in terms of androgens that keep in action and actually intelligently planning your stack design. You need enough estrogen, you need enough DHT, right? But then there are relatively more tissue selective anabolic drugs that you can manage your stack design with without having to use these ridiculous dosages of testosterone or something,
Well, definitely. And things happen in the dose response. I mean, they do. If you look at the literature, if you look at all the adverse effects, they are predicated as dose response. So you increase those levels up and you keep increasing them, and there is a dose responsive effect. Now, what happens when, what I always get is, well, my receptors are down regulating after a certain amount of time. Well, what is the real thing that's occurring? Well, there's a genetic ceiling, right?
Right. That's what I was going to say. You're just closer. You're just closer, further away from your normal set point. That's what's occurring.
And the oxidative stress will also just be climbing up with the higher doses of androgens,
Yeah,
You get
for
past
sure.
you.
And also myostatin.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Have a window for that too. So if you think about all those things, if there's so much literature out there right now, and there's so many more effective ways to do things than what was done in the 1990s. I mean, in the 1990s, I mean, that was a big shift in the amount of anabolics that was used. I mean, it really shifted for me because I've never heard of guys taking 2, 3, 4 grams. And then there was actually a guy, Paul Borson. I remember
Super high intensity cycle.
Oh, it was very high dose, cruise and blast. But one of the things that's important though is if you look at the literature on the central nervous system damage, and I won't go any further after this. There's substantial evidence now that a long-term use, cycling on and off, is actually more harmful than staying on.
Good. Yes.
And I say that with hesitation because it sort of gives somebody an open book.
There's some context to that.
Yeah.
Staying on meaning, normal physiological dose, not like cruising at 500 milligrams of test.
Well, that's not really a cruise. Yeah, I guess if you're actually, I've had one guy that I considered 1,000 as a cruising dose.
Wow.
So
He had that. That's what he said. That's what he thought.
He'd been cruising on 1,000 for years.
I hope he's big.
Yeah, he's big as a tank.
God,
So,
God, I would hope.
Yeah.
and wait, here's one more okay, I want to give some context to peptides. I've pulled a lot of case reports of autoimmune syndromes coming up when guys have used insulin, are different analogs of growth hormone, and various peptides. So be careful in what type of peptide you take, because if you're predisposed for an autoimmune reaction, in one instance, this one guy, he developed diabetes and his beta cells of his pancreas failed. And so he has to be on insulin forever now. So it's one of those things where, well, it doesn't happen to everyone. It's not really prevalent. Well, if it happens to you, it will be a big deal. So, but that is a thing that started to grow along with SARMs, liver injury from SARMs. I have case reports now of acute liver failure from SARMs. So, those SARMs aren't as safe as people make them out to believe. They're supposed to be more safe, but I mean, we really don't have long-term studies, years and years and years. I guess that's a good out for me, unless I'll just keep going. Really.
Maybe because we're coming up on time now. We've got 3 minutes left on the clock here. Maybe we could just sign off with Dr. Scott Howell's top 5 practical guidelines for safer use of PEDs.
Okay.
That would be cool.
Okay, let's see. The first is do not use aromatase inhibitors. There is no valid reason for aromatase inhibitor use in men. Anytime you block aromatase, it is a fail-safe mechanism. When you input an amount of androgen, it outputs the correct amount of aromatized estradiol, no matter what the form is. And that's needed to bind to the beta receptors of the heart. Number 2, stay away from SERMs. SERMs increase thrombotic risk just like AIs do, but AIs do to a less extent. Let's see, SERMs. Third, dose increases are not always the answer. So before considering a dose increase, plan things out, learn the mechanisms behind what's actually occurring with the adaptation of the skeletal muscle. And if you're going to use anabolic steroids and compete or whatever, don't cycle on and off continually using monotherapy, SERMs, and things like that, because that's worse. There's a lot of evidence now to support the development of dementia and amyloid plaque in the brain, deposition, and also loss of function in some areas of the brain. So that's bad. Let's see, what is another one? Anyone that uses anabolic steroids needs to be on an ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker.
So glad you've just said that, because on my article on telmisartan recently, I put at the end, I very rarely include an opinion piece, and I was going to open myself up for criticism here, and I should have done, but because I did put at the end that I would go so far as to say that everybody that's using exogenous anabolics should consider using an angiotensin receptor blocker, and I actually got a bit of flack for it, so I'm glad that you said that.
Well, I will quickly across the board back you 100%. I've got the studies, I know what's out there, and the literature is there. The literature shows that angiotensin receptor blockade will attenuate pathologic cardiovascular remodeling induced by anabolic steroids. So why not do it? I even recommend for most individuals that have any predisposition for cardiovascular disease and they're on testosterone therapy to use an ACE inhibitor or ARB. So
would you say for anyone on TRT or just using super physiological dose?
Well, anyone on that's taking anabolic steroids or super physiologic doses, they should be on ARB or ACE inhibitor.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I was just
testosterone replacement therapy. Here's the caveat: if you have a history of cardiovascular disease, you need to block angiotensin, no matter what the stimulus is. So yes, if there is caveats for that, and it would apply if there is a medical history.
Sure. Yep, that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure everyone understood the difference.
Sweet. Yes.
Cool.
That's done wonders for this podcast. Has done wonders for my my confirmation bias. I'm gonna leave here feeling like
I know. I feel so much. I feel so much better about some of the stuff that I tell people.
I think this is actually sorry. I think the most useful podcast for the listeners that we've had in a long time. Really enjoyed this one. I think, I can think of so many listeners that are going to really relish this one. So Scott, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's been highly informative. Exactly what we need is more stuff like this on how to use these safer use models, so to speak. And guys like yourself are putting out great work on it. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And it was a pleasure being on, talking to you both.
Sorry, go on.
Thank you guys for keeping it out there, because I've tried to pump it out on different mediums, and one mind at a time.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, you're going against the grain. I mean, there's these old school methodologies that are so ingrained in people, so some of this stuff is just hard to get through to people.
Well, yeah, when someone develops a belief, we call it belief perseverance, and it's no worse with aromatase inhibitors. If someone has a belief perseverance about aromatase inhibitor use, they will not objectively look at the literature. They
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, it's emotional, isn't it? Which is odd. People have a genuine emotional reaction to some of these things. It's such a firmly held belief that people get actually.
The key trait that I see for really good researchers is the ability to forget everything that you once thought you knew, and to learn from step one, and base everything on evidence, and amend your belief and change your belief when there's quality evidence there to support it.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, otherwise you're not really, especially for us, with what we do, you're not really servicing your clients very well if you keep your mind closed.
Oh, definitely not. And you have to stay on top of things too. And it's so hard to stay on top of this literature base, because I literally add 30 or 40 studies to my library every day. Every day. I get PubMed notifications. That's the only way I can keep up with it. And it changes so quick. But it's there. All the information is out there, but a lot of people just want an answer handed to them, and it's just not that simple. It never is.
Sure. Yeah, context. There's always context.
So, before we let you go, can you let us know where people can find you, where they can book consultations with you, any website or anything like this?
The website is www.tier1, that's the numeral 1, hw.com. You can go through the contact form there. My email is showell@tier1hw.com. I do genetics consultations, harm reduction. My heart is in this area, so that's where I put my passion. And I've had decent success with helping guys, but there's always the few that you can't help. So I try to help as many as I can.
Hey, Scott, well, I've got a full genome profile right here on the computer, so I think I might get in touch and get in a consultation with yourself.
Roger that. Great.
Good. And everybody listening, all of Dr. Scott Howell's links are going to be linked below. I'm sure many of you are going to check him out anyway. Obviously worth a follow-up. Anybody that is remotely interested in using safer models and I must stress this, believe me, you will end up in the same place. You will accrue the same amount of muscle mass over time, but you can do it in a manner that isn't going to bury you along the way. That's the important thing to hammer home here. We're not for 1 minute saying everyone should stay on TRT forever and no one's ever going to make any gains. But what it is about is getting to the same destination in a safer manner. Cool. Well, thank you, Scott, again. Thank you, Austin, for your time as always. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please check out the show notes to find all of Scott's links and Austin's links and my links. Please do check out the sponsors below that keep this show running, and we'll catch you guys next week. Thank you.